Do you think that this grace, this omnipotence, this love and charity of the Old Testament God is expressed in the instances where he commands the complete obliteration of entire nations of people, including the women and the children and even the animals, in at multiple points throughout the history of the Israelites trying to conquer their holy land, which is promised to them by God, such that if anybody is already living there, they're driven out. And if they refuse to leave, they're chased out and they're killed. And then they come back and they kill the women and the children. Do you think that this is the same graceful, loving God that's issuing these commands?
No. Instead, I think we've got to read very carefully. First point, do I allow God to judge? In my culture, that's unacceptable. And yet the Bible insists God does have the right to judge. Second point, is exaggeration being used? Is hyperbole being used in a lot of those passages? Yes, it is. Because clearly, obviously, many of those people who were supposedly all wiped out appear in the next book. So you know that they weren't all wiped out. Mm-hmm. Thirdly, you look at the archaeological evidence for Jericho and Ai, and you begin to realize those were probably smaller fortresses. Yes, Rahab was in there as a prostitute, but those were not just families and women and children. Those were fortresses that were protecting the families that lived out in the countryside around them. Next point is, I think that there is not the emphasis on individualism in the Old Testament that we have in our culture.
Yep.
And yet, the more we struggle through children of alcoholics and realize that there are real consequences that stretch down through the generations. And I think the Old Testament does present a picture that we are more interconnected than we as American individualists would like to admit. And when God judges a people group, yes, some innocent people are swept along in the judgment. And that bugs me. I don't like that. And yet, that is part of, I think, what the Bible is talking about when it says we're created in the image of God, meaning that we do have free will, which means there are consequences to my decisions that affect my children. You know, I think it's a complex issue, more complex than the person would allow it to be, who just says, I just can't believe that God would do something like that.
Like, what kind of instruction had these people been given? You know, like the people of Ai, the people of Jericho, the Canaanites. I mean, did they have Jewish prophets coming to them and saying, you should repent of your ways, or were they just sort of expected to work it out on their own?
Fascinating question. I'm not sure. I do not know. Obviously, they have consciences. We all have consciences.
Yeah.
And when you study ethics from around the world, it's amazing that it seems we're all like reading off the same sheet music.
Yeah.
And there's more and more research coming out, too, on just how bad these people groups really
Sure,
were.
right.
I'm seeing more of this.
Child sacrifice.
Canaanites, yeah, exactly. It just gets worse every year. Like, how bad is it going to get?
My job here isn't to say that this is wrong. My job is to say something like what Lincoln said of slavery. If this isn't wrong, then nothing is wrong. You know, if there is such a thing as objective morality, I find it very... I mean, look, we just condemned the Canaanites in part for, they were killing children. Well, that's exactly what God ordered the Israelites to do when they came into their nation. And we say, okay, well, these people were sinful, idolatrous, and they should have repented. Well, the same is true of the Israelites. They were sinful, they were idolatrous. And yet they had the benefit of having the prophet of God come to them with literal stone tablets telling them what to do. And even then it took them a few tries to get right. The Canaanites didn't have that. And yet when the Israelites are sinful, they get a prophet who comes and sets them straight. When the Canaanites are sinful, they get obliterated. It's something you're not interested in doing, debating William Lane Craig? Or having a conversation perhaps with William Lane Craig?
I have done. I've vowed not to. I feel such contempt for him because of his... I don't know whether you've seen what he says about the Israelites slaughtering the Midianites, and instead of saying what any decent theologian would say, well, it never happened, and this is just Old Testament story. He says, well, the Midianites had it coming because they were so sinful, and then if you worry about the Midianite children who had their brains beaten out of them, that's okay because they went straight to heaven, and that finished him off as far as I was concerned.
A few moments ago, you told me that the idea of the New Testament in general about being born in sin and needing salvation is an evil idea.
Yes.
And yet that's an idea that many of the opponents that you have spoken to will have believed. They believe evil things too. So why particularly with William Lane Craig?
It's a fair point. I think the thing is that the Christian theologians who take this seriously are honestly well-meaning. I mean, they believe in the God of love. They believe in Jesus as the Son of God of love, and so on. I think the sheer they would never have defended the slaughter of the Midianites and the Jebusites and things in the book of Joshua as somehow justified because the Midianites were sinful. I think it's an order of magnitude worse there. Perhaps you would disagree with that.
Maybe. I mean, I think there's a sense in which a Christian who believes in the historicity of the Old Testament, I mean, the Midianites might be, I'm sometimes told it's complicated by the fact that it's Moses who instructs the slaughter of the Midianites, but it seems clear to me that this is sanctioned by God. I think that a Christian who believes in the historicity of the Old Testament just has to believe that whatever happened there was somehow okay with God, was somehow moral. Now, I agree that to me is a criticism I make all the time. How could this be moral? But I also say, how could it be moral that God allows children to get cancer? How could it be moral that,
yes.
God, and I suppose the thing that I would say is that if you pressed a Christian, well, if there's a good God, why do children get cancer? They just have to say something like, there must be some reason for this. There must be some explanation.
Yes, I suppose that if they really do if they really do believe the literal word of the Bible, but then that brings us back to fundamentalist creationists. I mean,
well, even just in terms of why God would allow evil at all. What I'm imagining, in other words, is suppose we had this other Christian philosopher debater, and somebody had said to them, well, why do children get cancer if there's a good God? And they said, look, if I believe in a good God, I have to believe that the children who die of cancer are going to heaven. I have to believe that there's some reason for the suffering that they're undergoing.
Yes.
Now, you could say, this person said that, kids who have cancer, they should be grateful because they're going straight to heaven. And there's some reason to give children cancer. That's despicable. I want nothing to do with this person. I'll never debate them. However, I would suppose that basically everybody that you've debated on the topic of Christianity would say something like that about cancer in children.
Would.
And so I wonder why with William Lane Craig it's a particular problem.
You make a good point.
I would love to pull back a little bit.
Sure.
And ask you, what are your values kind of rooted in and grounded in? Where would we start with that?
So I'm an ethical emotivist, which is a form of ethical non-cognitivism. I don't think that ethical claims have truth value. I think they're expressions of emotion.
If we're pulling back a little bit, I remember reading at the end of Richard Dawkins' book, The God Delusion, that we can't trust our senses because evolution doesn't really care about making truth claims. It cares about surviving.
I don't know.
Do you agree with that?
I don't think Dawkins actually endorsed that argument, but it's a good argument. C.S. Lewis, Alvin Plantinga, the argument from reason, sure.
But would you agree or disagree with that?
Well, I mean, I remain agnostic on what reason is, but I think it's a powerful argument.
When it comes to determining if suffering is wrong or right...
So crucially, I'm not saying that suffering is morally wrong.
Right.
Outside of the senses that I, as an emotivist, will just express an emotion towards it, that I don't like it. I'm not claiming that it's immoral, that it's objectively bad. What I'm claiming is that suffering is unexpected on theism. It's an internal critique, right? Lincoln said of slavery, if this is not wrong, then nothing is wrong. You don't have to believe that something's wrong, but if there is such a thing as objective morality, I don't think that it would consist in a God who oversees the amount of suffering that we have on planet Earth.
Timothy Keller does this story about no-see-ums. Have you heard of the no-see-um story?
No.
Yeah, so he says if you have a tent and you look in there and you say, hey, I think I have some dogs in the tent. Maybe, like, for example, I have a golden doodle. He's a killer. That was just a joke, but we can move on. And if I said, hey, I have a golden doodle inside the tent, you would expect to see one. But if I said, hey, there's some no-see-ums. These little gnats are so tiny they actually go through the screen.
Sure.
He says, there's some no-see-ums in the tent. You might look in there and go, I don't see any no-see-ums. But of course you don't see no-see-ums because nobody can see them.
Okay, so...
Just because there's maybe not a reason that we can identify doesn't mean that there can't be a reason. Now, it's kind of cold comfort. That doesn't get us 100% of the way there, but it gets us part of the way there.
That's true. So the existence of evil is not logically, or suffering is not logically incompatible with God's existence. But it's a bit like if somebody came up to me right now and stole my friend's wallet in front of me and shot him dead and ran away, and I was grieving, and somebody said to me, well, hey man, you don't know, that person might have worked for the CIA, and your friend might have secretly been harboring the nuclear codes, and killing him might have been good for the country, and he stole the wallet because that's where the codes were. And I would say, well, what evidence do you have for that? And you say, well, look, just because I don't have evidence for it doesn't mean that there might not be some evidence that I don't know about. I would say, until I see why I should think that's the case, I'm not going to believe it. And I'm certainly not going to be less upset in my grieving over my friend because of the possibility that there could be an explanation for it. There's so much suffering imbued in the human experience that if somebody says, well, look, there could be an explanation, it's like, okay, fine, but let me know when you know what it is.
Agree. I think the thing that's hard...
Pause.
Many people think that, I understand what you're saying, that the physicists can't go beyond the physical, but we can like extrapolate explanations from the physical data, right? Like in the same way that if I were to look at some evidence around me, if we all left this room and somebody came in and saw that there were some glasses on the table and saw that there was a book placed kind of in the middle of the table and all this kind of stuff, they didn't see any human beings, they didn't see any agents, but they can just extrapolate from the arrangement of the descriptions that they see of the way the room is. There must have been somebody there. In the same way, the physicists might not be able to sort of look beyond the material, but can they look at the strength of the strong and weak nuclear forces and the fact that if gravity was a tiny little bit stronger, the universe would have collapsed in on itself, and a bit weaker and everything would have flown apart, and think, I can't see any evidence of design directly, but I can extrapolate from that there must be some kind of intelligence behind the universe.
Yeah, so bear in mind, number one, often people do say that if you change the value of the physical parameters just a little bit, the universe as we know it goes away. The problem with that is we can only do that analysis if you change the parameters by a little bit. If you allow the parameters to change by a lot of bit, not a little bit, and you allow many of the parameters to change simultaneously, nobody can really say what that cosmos would be like. And so it's possible that there are patches in parameter space where you would get different kinds of universes that perhaps would give rise to different living systems. And then each living system in its universe looks around and says, wow, this universe is so special. It must be that there's some kind of, grand design that got us here. But they're all saying that in their own parameter space because they're all making this mistake of only looking in a small neighborhood around the point in parameter space where they exist. So that's point number one. The analogy is if you go into a clothing shop and you want to buy a sports coat, and you say, I want to buy a sports coat, and you see only one on the rack, and the person brings it over and it fits you perfectly. You're like, wow, that is so fortunate that it was just the right size to fit me. But if you go into an actual clothing shop, when there's hundreds of different sports jackets on the rack of all different sizes, when the person comes and brings you one that fits, you're not surprised. Of course, there's one among the many that works for you. Yep. And so if you have many jackets, it's obvious why one will fit. If you have many universes, it's also pretty obvious why one will fit the conditions necessary to our existence. And so it is a natural way of avoiding the problem that you're making reference to. The specialness of this universe goes away if it's one of a grand collection of possibilities.
I'm imagining walking into a jacket shop and it's just like a tiny little store, somewhere in New York on like the second floor, right? And it just has a few jackets and a few pairs of trousers. And I try on this jacket and it is like perfect. I mean, it's the exact shade of blue that I was looking for. I send it to my camera guy and he does the little hex code and he's like, man, this is like exactly the right color temperature. The sleeves are the perfect length, like uncannily perfect. Like everything is great. It's even got like a name tag from the previous owner that says Alex on it, just by pure and I think, man, this is absolutely unbelievable. I'm saying to my friend, this is unbelievable. I can't believe every single time I look at it, something new that just unfathomably coincidental. And the friend says, okay, this is amazing. What must have happened is that there are actually like an infinite number of jackets that are sort of sat in the back. And every time somebody comes into the shop, they sort of bring one out by chance and hope that it's a match. And I suppose we must also have sort of existed in New York for an infinite amount of time so that this guarantees that at least once this goes right. And of course, you're going to be the one that gets it right because otherwise you wouldn't be having this amazing experience. compared to just what I naively experience, which is like one room and a jacket which fits perfectly, I would basically ask that friend to give me more reason outside of the convenience of explaining this coincidence to believe in that infinite set of jackets, to think that it's actually true.
It seems very, as it were, simple to say that same sex, if someone is homosexual and wants sexual relations with another homosexual, society ought to allow that, simply because you're just taking these two people into account. But the consequence of making this general might be rather disastrous, and I think in some respects it would be, because it would denigrate marriage, and marriage is very important because it through marriage that we have stable families in which to build up children. Now, two homosexuals can't have that sort of relation to their children. They can't have children in that way. So, if one encourages homosexuality instead of, as it were, discouraging that practice, that will be to the benefit of society as a whole.
Crucially, I also wanted to point out that it is true. It is true that the Bible does mention homosexuality a few times. It mentions it a bit in the Old Testament, quite explicitly condemning it as at least a sexual practice, if not an orientation. The New Testament, Paul mentions it possibly a few times, probably a few times, but it's always difficult to translate. Of course, Jesus didn't mention it once at all.
It's not a matter of what necessarily Scripture said. It's a matter of what the Church has pretty unanimously taught for 20th century as the teaching of God.
What I would invite people to do if they wish to see evidence of moral relativism, the kind of moral relativism that is often abhorred by religious communities as dangerous, as flippant, as the idea that you could change your moral opinions yesterday to today, and that would show that there's no objective thread, or at least that we can't trust the source from which it comes. I would invite people to investigate the history of the Church's relationship to slavery, and particularly the scriptural injunctions towards the ownership of other human beings as private property, the bequeathing of them to your children as inheritable property, and the differential treatment of slaves who are Israelites and slaves who are not. That is mentioned a lot more than homosexuality, and it's much more, in much more detail and with much more moral force, I think. And so what I wanted to point out is that it's easy to say, well, it's just a fact. If God says this is wrong, then this is wrong. God said a similar thing of slavery, but I hope and trust that most people in this room would disagree with at least that injunction.
Yes, but when the Christian church started, what it says in the Old Testament must be interpreted in the light of the teaching of Jesus. And the church itself was inspired by God to work out the consequences of this teaching. So, the church at very beginning ruled out all sorts of things that the Old Testament says are not binding.
But of course, also in 1 Peter, we read, slaves, be obedient to your masters, not just the ones who are good, but
I
also
think
the ones who are cruel.
There's enough time of Scripture.
We find, I'm not sure that it is. We of course also find Jesus telling an analogy and quite casually including the status of a slave within an analogy, or within a metaphor that he was giving to his disciples when he says to them, well, which one of you would, when a slave comes to you, say, come and eat at our table, and wouldn't first say, go and do your duty, then come to me? Now, that's not necessarily an explicit commandment to own slaves or anything like that, but you would think that if it was known to be wrong, or thought to be wrong by Jesus, he would have at least chosen a different example. In other words, it's certainly normal, still in the New Testament I'm talking about, and in at least one case in 1 Peter also, commanded, and possibly reaffirmed in Galatians 2, where Paul says, there is neither slave nor free. This might be a reaffirmation of slavery. He says, there's neither slave nor free, for we're all one in Christ. But he then says, there's neither slave nor free, male nor female. I don't think that Paul was a radical gender abolitionist, ladies and gentlemen. I think that Paul was saying that although these statuses obviously exist on earth quite clearly, they're irrelevant to your salvation in Christ. If that's the case, unless we want to accept that the New Testament is also, as I say, radically gender non-conformist, then I think we have to accept that it
was
also
a matter of
slavery.
I'm going to move us away from the debate around scripture and Christianity.
So all those converging lines of fact-based discussion can be brought to bear on this navigation problem.
Yeah.
Right.
So because I've got this subjective preference to reach this peak, I can use all of the scientific resources available to me to go and reach that peak.
Okay, now what if we just add one other element to this, which is you've got your preference weights such as they are now, you got the factory settings, but you didn't pick your parents, you didn't pick your genes, you didn't pick the factory, you didn't pick your culture and the world into which you were born, and you've been tuned up by forces beyond your control.
Yep.
Now we have something like a completed science of the mind, and you can actually change your preferences.
Okay.
Right. And there's this additional question of whether you should do that, whether that would be a good thing to do, but good as measured by what?
Well, in my universe, we don't have terms like good yet. That hasn't entered into the
so
picture yet.
you'll just say boo differently if we change those weights, right?
So let's say like somebody offers me the opportunity to take a pill, and let's say that in this world I don't really like music that much.
Right.
So I don't really care for it, whatever. And I can take a pill that's suddenly going to turn me into this great music lover where I'm going to experience this brand new joy. And although right now my preference isn't to enjoy music, so it doesn't seem to matter to me, I can change my preferences so that now this new pleasure opens up to me and I can experience it. What would I do? I'd look at that pill and I'd go, yeah, sounds great, awesome. And I'd take the pill just because I would prefer to have that preference. It's a second order preference, right? But there's still no space here into which has entered a concept of like moral prescription, of goodness, of ought. I'm still just in this world where there are experiences I prefer, and I use my scientific analysis of the world to achieve those. And when something comes along that allows me to really radically improve that feeling of subjective preference, hell yeah, use all the science you can get to give me those pills.
Right.
But still no moral judgments here, right?
Well, there are potentially, but they might not be necessary. I mean, like, as long as you're going to concede that you might not know what you're missing, if you might not know how good life could be if you only made certain changes to yourself or to your thinking or to your culture, right? So we have a bunch of people like you who just don't want to talk about shoulds and oughts, right? And they never do. They just occasionally they say boo, but they don't think anything really hangs on it. And then if it could be an empirical fact about you and or people like you, that you're cognitively and emotionally and culturally and civilizationally closed to certain outcomes, which are available the moment you begin to play a little bit differently.
I'm not sure why those would be correlated, because like this idea that, there are experiences that are available to me that I don't even know what I'm missing. That doesn't require me to believe in any concept of morality, because if you said to me,
I'm still just on the so again I'm bracketing morality, the judgmental valence of that term for the purpose of this part of the conversation. I'm just saying that this descriptively we're in the descriptive still value laden landscape of this feels much, much better than this over here, which I never want to taste or touch again, right?
Crucially, just for clarity, I would say, in my view here, this is subjective value. These are subjectively valued.
These are objective facts about conscious systems.
Objective facts about how to best achieve what one subjectively values.
Yeah, but that turn doesn't do anything deflationary for me. It's just there are certain things that only exist as appearances in consciousness, right? That is their ontological status, right? There's no, even if we could later correlate them with other states of the physics of things, it's just, you can't conceptually reduce them. You can't be, there's no, the there is as conscious experiences, right? And I would say consciousness itself is one of those things. It's just that the only evidence for consciousness in this universe is as consciousness. Right, it's like there's no evidence in a brain that consciousness is a thing, right?
Okay. So is there something from this picture that we've been painting so far, where I've started in a world? I don't know why I'm imagining like I'm on some desert island, like we're starting from scratch, like the opening Minecraft game or something. I'm just here in this world, and there are things I prefer and things that I don't, and I start to learn scientifically through observation which things are going to get me what I want and which things aren't. So I start acting in accordance. Then we all get together, and because it's going to be good for me if I work with this person, we work together and we start developing maybe this pill, and then somebody comes over on a boat and says, hey, there's this great thing that you don't even know that you're missing, give it a go. And I'm so open-minded that I'm like, yeah, sounds awesome. And the pleasures are just increasing and increasing all the time. And again, like the end, end scene, story's over. That's the picture for me.
Right.
Because if it is the case that there are in fact moral values in the world, like there is this thing called objective moral truth. The picture I've just painted, as far as I can see, doesn't contain it. So what's wrong about that picture? Where's it gone wrong?
One of my professors at Dartmouth was Robert Jastrow. He headed the Mount Wilson Laboratory, one of the great astronomers of the 20th century.
Sure.
So Jastrow writes in his book, God and the Astronomers, that for 250 years, modern science has been attempting to discover whether the universe had a beginning. And you can think of these scientists as ascending a very tall mountain in which there are many pathways. And for many years, with the steady state hypothesis and so on, there were beliefs that the universe was eternal. It never had a beginning. In fact, that was the prevailing point of view. And then Jastrow argues it's almost as if we reached the top of the mountain and there was a bunch of Hebrew prophets or theologians sitting there who had been there from the beginning. This is a question that's been argued for 2 centuries and only resolved in the last several decades, and resolved decisively in one side and the other. And the fact that you're not willing to just straight out say, yeah, it is actually an astounding fact that we now know.
No. I mean, look, the scientific method has also revealed to us that the Earth was formed about 4.5 billion years ago. That is much later than the sun. The Old Testament account, the Hebrew Bible account, tells us that it was the other way around. So it got that bit wrong.
All right. So we're. Yes, the Bible is not.
So sometimes it gets things right. Sometimes it gets things wrong.
The Bible is not a science. It's not listing out a scientific.
Well, now hold on a second. You can't now move the goalpost, especially if you're still going to miss.
The issue. The issue of the origin of the universe is extremely critical.
You just told me that Genesis predicted, or knew about, or somehow knew about the scientific hypothesis of the origin of the universe. Then, when I pointed out another scientific observation that doesn't accord with Genesis, you tell me that Genesis isn't a scientific text to begin with.
Well, if you read Genesis, it is making a astounding claim which pertains to God. Obviously, God created the heavens and the earth.
Is it making a scientific claim or not? Is it telling us how the universe scientifically formed or not?
It's not telling us how the universe scientifically formed, because if it did, they would be outlining the history of the Big Bang.
Then what's the relevance of bringing this up in the first place?
Because it is stating a conclusion, not a process. It's not telling you how the universe was formed. Right. It's not telling you about...
It also doesn't tell us how the sun was formed, but it tells us that it was formed after the earth was. It tells us that that's the case. That's wrong. It's incorrect.
You're right, but the mainstream of the Christian tradition does. It obviously can't be day 4 because the concept of day in the original Hebrew doesn't mean day.
Sure, but day 4 comes after day 1, right?
It's describing obviously epochs or periods.
Yeah,
yes.
So actually it's much worse, because now the sun is created much later than the earth was. It's not astonishing to me that like if you're making claims about the origin of the universe, especially in the case where if it is making a specific claim in the knowledge that there's a sort of infinite hypothesis and a beginning hypothesis, to take a 50-50 stab, it's not amazing to me. It would be more amazing to me if everything lined up and it gave us an otherwise unknowable historical scientific account of the beginning of the universe. But as you say, that's not even what Genesis is trying to do. Right, the main questions at hand are these. Does objective morality in fact exist? And if it does, how does the atheist ground it without God? Is that possible? Well, let's see what Hitchens has to say.
If Christopher Hitchens does not believe in God, reviewers have asked, then where does he get his sense of right and wrong? You have replied in print that this question is in itself insulting, and you have rejected, quote, the appalling insinuation that I would not know right from wrong if I was not supernaturally guided, close quote. Why do you find it insulting?
Because I think it's degrading to the human, to us, to you and me, to imply, well, not to imply, to state directly that absent a celestial dictatorship that had some supernatural influence over us, yet to be established, by the way, as anything really existent, but without the assumption of it, we wouldn't know right from wrong.
Degrading it may be, Hitch, but you're not answering the question. Okay, the question was asked, how do you determine right and wrong without God? And Hitchens responds that this is insulting because it suggests that we potentially can't determine right and wrong without God. Well, yes, that's the question. He hasn't actually made a point. He's just restated the question and said that it's insulting. Well, tough luck if it's insulting. That doesn't constitute an answer. His point is, of course, that the question is a silly one, but he needs to provide a justification for why it's silly, not just say that it is, relying on his audience's tendency to go, yeah, I don't need God, to get us riled up at the very question.
We wouldn't return stolen property if we found it in the back of a cab. We wouldn't give blood if someone badly needed a transfusion, unless we were afraid either of punishment or desirous of a reward, that we might help ourselves to underage children, as some religious people have actually been known to do. Because, after all, what's stopping us? Now, you could tell me, if you wanted, that you would do all those things if you weren't God-fearing, but I would choose not to believe you. I have more respect for you, if not for your opinions, than that.
This is the next thing that Hitchens would regularly do on this point. He conflates two different questions. By saying, of course you would still be moral if you didn't believe in God, he's responding to the idea that atheists can't be moral. But that wasn't the question. The question was not how can atheists be moral, but how can atheists ground their morality? This is a subtle difference, but it's crucial. Hitchens has got a lot of praise for making this kind of argument. Of course I'm still moral despite not believing in the supernatural dictator. I'm insulted that you would suggest that I can't act ethically without divine permission.
I don't believe in the rest of it, don't believe in the prophets, don't believe in the mountaintop, don't believe in the revelation. Well, nor should you. But how dare you suggest to us that we couldn't teach our children self-restraint and respect for others and the golden rule? How dare you?
But when the religious say that there cannot be such thing as morality without God, they're not saying that there cannot be such thing as morality without belief in God. They say that you can be an atheist and be moral, you just can't objectively ground your morality. So when Hitchens asks, how dare you say that I can't be moral without believing in God, he's answering an objection that was never put to him. He's answering a different question, one that the religious rarely, if ever, actually ask. But when the question is framed more clearly, sometimes Hitchens understands that he is in fact being asked to ground morality, not just to prove that he's a moral person. Let's have a look at what he has to say when this occurs.
At every time I'm asked this question, if you didn't believe in God, how would you know what was good and what wasn't? Every time I'm asked to speak on this, the daily news allows me to give a different answer and give a different example. Take the simplest case of what I believe is innate, our instinct for our children. You don't have to be a parent to have this. You see a child trying to rush into the traffic. If you're not a parent, something tells you what you probably ought to be doing about it. The care and love and protection of children is instinct in us, in fact in many other species too that don't claim to be divinely ordered around. It's something we all share without having to have it explained to us.
So Hitchens is answering the following question. How do we ground our sense of morality? And his answer? Well, we all have a sense of morality within us. The question is, how do you know that it's right to care about children? His answer? Well, any parent instinctively cares about children. But we're not interested in whether we have a moral instinct. Of course we do. Who doesn't know this? What we're interested in is how to justify the moral instinct, which Hitchens fails to do by simply appealing to the fact that the instinct exists. A further elaboration on this comes from Hitchens' debate with Frank Turek, in which the same question is raised.
If God does not exist, why do all people have a fixed moral obligation to love and not murder? How do molecules in motion have any authority to tell you how to behave? When you do something wrong, whose standard are you breaking? Who are you displeasing? The carbon atom, the benzene molecule, who?
This question has been asked, Socrates answered it like this, when he was on trial for his life. Accused of blasphemy, by the way. He said that he had an inner daemon, was the way he put it. Not demon, a daemon, a spirit, an inner critic, a conscience would be one way of putting it. And that he knew enough to know, even when he was making the best speech of his life, that if he was making a point that was somehow dishonest or incomplete or shady, the daemon would tell him, yeah, that was clever, but you shouldn't have tried it. He knew. Okay? Any person of average moral equipment has the same knowledge. I hope you'll. If you don't, I'm very sorry for you. Adam Smith called it the internal witness, who we all have to have a conversation with all the time. It's been C.S. Lewis decided to call it conscience and to attribute it to the divine, but he didn't improve on what Adam Smith said in Theory of Moral Sentiments or what Socrates said when standing trial for his own life.
Again, Hitchens is asked, of those moral instincts that he has, how does he know that they are objectively correct? His answer? Well, Socrates answered this well by saying that we have a moral instinct within us. That's not the question. The question is, how do we justify the instinct? Hitchens is totally avoiding the question. And if you think I'm being unfair here, take a listen to what he says next. Still talking about the moral instinct within him, he says this.
It's been sometimes colloquially defined as, why do people behave well when nobody's looking? I don't believe there's anyone in this hall who doesn't know what I mean by that.
The instinct is sometimes defined as, why do people do good things when nobody is looking? Hitchens is, in other words here, conceding the very point in question, that the moral instinct he has identified within us leaves wide open the question of why it exists and how we can justify it. Also, note how, when talking about this intuition, Hitchens says anyone of average moral equipment has the same knowledge.
Any person of average moral equipment has the same knowledge. I hope you'll. If you don't, I'm very sorry for you.
This implicitly recognizes that some people don't share his moral intuition. Some people don't have the same moral equipment. The question we are asking is, how can we know whose moral intuitions are correct? Hitchens responds by saying that you'll have the correct moral instinct if you have the proper moral equipment. Well, how do we know who has the proper moral equipment? Of course, because they have the correct moral instinct. This is the definition of circularity.
It's important to understand that God's command to Israel was not genocide, despite a superficial first reading of these narratives. More fundamentally, it was a command to drive the Canaanites out of the land on pain of death. No one had to be killed if these tribes would simply retreat and flee in the face of the advancing Israeli army. It was only those who tried to stay behind and resist who were to be completely exterminated. So people didn't have to die. They weren't pursued and chased down until everyone was exterminated. These clans were driven out of the land. They were be destroyed as nation states, but not as individual people.
If I may, on this point that we've got to so far, firstly, this idea that, well, not everybody's killed because they're given the opportunity to leave their land. They're given the opportunity to be driven out. It's only if they stay and resist that they get killed. And the way you just cash that out is by saying, so they had a decision and didn't have to die. It seems to me that, of course, you're going to understand this as something that God has commanded. So whatever the reason may be, it must be the morally right thing to do. However, from my perspective, what I'm seeing here is a foreign nation approaching the native inhabitants of land which they believe is their own, saying, you need to leave. And when they refuse, killing them and then saying, well, look, I gave you a choice, didn't I? Because you could have just left. I mean, that in other words, doesn't seem like much of a defense to me.
It is very possible that had this been undertaken by human initiative alone, that it would have been immoral, as the way you described. But the ethical theory that I defend is called divine command morality. And this has two components to it. First is that the good is based in God himself. God is the paradigm of moral goodness. He is by nature loving, fair, just, and so forth. Second element is that God's nature then expresses itself toward us in the form of divine commands that constitute our moral duties. So if God wills to end the life of the Canaanite children prematurely, that's his prerogative. So God doesn't have the same sort of moral constraints that we do, because he doesn't have moral obligations to fulfill. He has to act only in consistency with his own nature.
Now, I see a few problems with this, and I think my listeners will too intuitively. There's nothing I can say to prove that that's wrong, that maybe God can just permit things like the killing of innocent children by an Israelite clan. Maybe that is just okay. But the problems this raises include things like this is raised by Randall Rouser. He points out that this seems to undermine our ability to trust moral intuition. In other contexts, such as in the moral argument for the existence of God, you might appeal to the fact that we all know that certain things are morally right and morally wrong, and we sort of use that feeling to say that there must be some objective element of morality in the universe, and we use that to construct an argument for the existence of God. It seems, as Rouser points out, that nothing could be more intuitively wrong to me in this regard than the killing of an innocent child. And what we're told to believe is that, okay, maybe most of the time that's wrong. Maybe that's always wrong unless it's specifically commanded by God. But sometimes it is actually just okay as long as God commands it. It can't be intrinsically wrong if there are circumstances in which it's actually not just permitted, but in fact the thing that you're ordered to do.
I would say that it is wrong in the absence of a divine command, but that God has the ability to override that by issuing a divine command, which then becomes our moral duty. Unfortunately, children die all the time in infancy. And so if God wants to end the life of these Canaanite children early, prematurely, that's his prerogative. But then secondly, on my theology, these children go immediately to heaven. They go to be with God.
You must understand how that sounds, saying it was a blessing for these children to be killed and go to God. I mean, this is something that Dawkins quotes you on directly, and I'm interested in you share my assessment here that even if he's not correct, I can understand why he would hear you say something like that and think that it's morally repugnant, that it's revolting. In any other context, if somebody says something like, well, maybe the murder of these children, I suppose you wouldn't see it as murder, but the killing of these innocent children is a blessing to them, it just seems again to run against our intuitions. Take the issue of abortion, for example. Now, you might think that it's immoral to have an abortion because God has commanded that you shouldn't take innocent life, in the absence of some specific divine command, sure. But a lot of the time in this discussion, people do talk in language which points to how this is bad for the child. You're taking away the life of a child. You're committing some wrong towards the child. This position that you're advocating here would seem to remove the ability to do that. You can still say that abortion is wrong if you like, but you can't say that it in any way harms the child. In fact, it seems like you're committed to the view that it confers a great good upon the child when a parent has an abortion.
Absolutely. I mean, what it would do it would rob the child of the goods of this finite life.
So you, Dr. Craig, are a Canaanite. You wake up and you find yourself in the land, and through essentially accident of birth, you've been born into a community that has raised you to have quite immoral tendencies and practices. You're surrounded by all kinds of sin, and you engage in it yourself.
Right. Don't make me sound like an innocent victim. If I'm one of them, I am an incredibly evil and reprobate person.
I suppose there's a whole other question which we don't have time to go into about the fact that being born into such a society might be a little unfair if it almost necessitates you become an immoral person. But the question I wanted to ask is, suppose you are such a person, right? A foreign nation is approaching with their swords, and they say to you, leave this land or we're going to put you to the sword. My question to you is, are you justified? Is it justified for you to fight back?
I mean, ultimately, it's not justified because it would be transgressing a divine command, and therefore wouldn't be justified. But I could well understand again how epistemically one might feel justified in resisting this foreign army. Though I hope that if I were in such a condition, I would have the good sense to get out.
Dawkins quotes an article that you wrote in response to this issue, and I suppose I should read what the point that he pulled out, which summarizes this position here. You said, "So whom does God wrong in commanding the destruction of the Canaanites? Right. Not the Canaanite adults, for they were corrupt and deserving of judgment. Not the children, for they inherit eternal life. So who is wronged? Ironically, I think the most difficult part of this whole debate is the apparent wrong done to the Israeli soldiers themselves. Yeah. Can you imagine what it would be like to have to break into some house and kill a terrified woman and her children? The brutalizing effect on these Israeli soldiers is disturbing. I must say that the disturbing thing to me there is I can't shake this feeling. And like I say, I have respect for you as a thinker and a philosopher, and I always enjoy our conversations. But hearing somebody talking about the slaughter of admittedly and explicitly innocent children, not to mention animals, as well as the eradication, driving out of an entire society, and to say that, well, the people who really suffered here were the soldiers who had to kill the innocent woman. It just, in a way that like I said at the very beginning of this segment, there's nothing I can do strictly speaking to prove that there's no justification for this. But if there is anything that I've ever heard in my life that jumps out of a page with pure moral repugnance in the way that it meets my ears, it has to be something like that.